Okay, so welcome everyone. Very excited to be doing this program. Before I introduce myself and say a little bit more about what we're going to do today, I wanted to hand it over to Cristobal from the Collective to say a little bit more about the translation and transcription. So Cristobal, do you want to go
Yeah,
ahead and jump?
thank you. Hi everyone, hola a todos. Mi nombre es Cristóbal. Estoy aquí con mi colega Pau. Somos parte del colectivo Babilla. My name is Cristóbal. I'm here with my colleague Pau. We're part of Babilla Collective, and we're going to be providing simultaneous interpretation from Spanish to English and English to Spanish for today's event. Vamos a estar ofreciendo interpretación simultánea para español-inglés, inglés-español al evento de hoy. So just some brief instructions in both languages so folks can be familiar on how to activate the feature. You can find a globe icon that says interpretation on the bottom right of your screen. Once you see that icon, you can click on it, select the preferred channel you would like to listen to, and you will be listening to the interpretation simultaneously in that channel. Unas instrucciones en ambos lenguajes para que se familiaricen con cómo activar la función de interpretación. En la parte inferior derecha del Zoom pueden ver un icono de globo que dice interpretación. Una vez le den clic a ese icono, pueden escoger entre español o inglés para escuchar la interpretación simultánea durante el evento. You can change the language at any moment by clicking again on the icon and selecting another language. There's also an option to silence the original meeting language and only listen to the voice of the interpreter. Puedes cambiar el lenguaje en cualquier momento volviendo a seleccionar en ese icono, y también hay una tercera opción para silenciar el audio de la reunión original y solo escuchar la voz del intérprete. Thank you very much. We are happy to make this a more accessible space and have a great event. Muchas gracias. Estamos muy felices de hacer este espacio más accesible y que tengan un buen evento.
Right. Thank you very much, Cristobal. Welcome again for those of you who just joined. My name is Patryk Tomaszewski. As you can see here right on the screen, I'm a Joan Tisch Teaching Fellow here at the Whitney Museum of American Art. I'm also a PhD candidate in art history at the CUNY Graduate Center. And today I will have a pleasure of starting off our three-course lecture, or rather I should say three-lecture course that will be led by myself and two of my colleagues in the coming weeks. Today, we're starting with an idea, a concept that I'm sure some of you, if not all of you, are familiar with, the palimpsest, a traditionally, or something that is traditionally referred to, a manuscript or document that has been written on, scraped off and used again. Metaphorically, however, extending to any kind of layering of information over time in one document or place. That's part of the description of the event that I'm including here on the screen. And I'm doing that because I also wanted to flag and emphasize, I guess, rather than flag, that what we're going to do today is not necessarily just about writing things on and scraping them off and then using them again. We're also going to think about this concept in a more metaphorical way, in addition to thinking, of course, about the physical process itself. So I'd like to think about what we're going to focus on today and the artist that we're going to look at today through the lens of accumulation. Sometimes that accumulation, as I said, is physical. Sometimes that accumulation is more conceptual. But overall, the idea here is really to think about ways in which these artists, these wonderful five artists who I'm going to introduce in just a moment, were thinking, and some of them continue to think, and employ these various historical, physical, technical, and other ways of accumulating information in order to make the work compelling and in order to help us understand our very complex world, socioeconomically and sociopolitically, help us understand that world a little better. I mentioned five artists who are going to be discussed today, and I decided to create this map here, or show you this map here with all of the names, because I think it's quite extraordinary to one, acknowledge that all of these artists are women artists, something that is really important to emphasize, given the institutional histories of collecting and institutional histories of museums in the Western world, where, of course, women were not always afforded the same opportunities as men. And importantly, several women, actually majority of the women who we have here today will be women of color. And we're starting with Mavis Pusey. I'm going to briefly just introduce all of them across this map, who was born in Jamaica, What's interesting here is, and important, is that Mavis Pusey is the only artist in the biennial who is no longer alive. She's no longer with us. She died in 2019. And I think it's important to also mention and emphasize here that when she was born in Jamaica, it was still a colony. Maja Ruznic, here we see that she was born in what was then Yugoslavia, now Bosnia and Herzegovina, much, much younger, and an artist who, as we'll see, is thinking about these questions of accumulation on various registers that are both physical, historical, and political. Then we also have Karen Olivier, who's going to come third, born originally in Trinidad and now active in the United States, born in 1968. We'll have Clarissa Tossin, who is from Brazil, originally born in Porto Alegre in Brazil in 1973. And finally, we'll end with Suzanne Jackson, born in 1944. So the most experienced, I should say, of all of these artists who are still alive, of the five, and one who, as we'll see, really is redefining painting and what painting is as practice, and how that idea of the palimpsest actually manifests itself perhaps most literally in her work. There's one painting or one work that actually is titled The Palimpsest, but we're going to get to it at the very end. I'm starting with Mavis Pusey, not just because she's the most historically, I guess most historically steeped in our institution as the Whitney, but also because I think she gives us an opportunity to think about some of these modernist vocabularies of painting, more traditional modernist vocabularies of painting, and thinking about ways in which she redefined them and reconceptualized them. And yet at the same time, for quite a while, was not given, I would say up until this year's biennial, was not given the kind of recognition that she deserves. And I think it is really important to emphasize that Mavis Pusey, despite the fact that she's no longer with us, is included in this biennial, because it's not the Whitney trying to fix things. Rather, I think it's us having an opportunity to look at how an artist so talented and extraordinary as Mavis Pusey can help us understand the history of the city specifically a little bit better. And I think there's a lot of things that are very topical to her work. I'm starting with the work that you've been looking at this photograph now for a few seconds, a photograph that was taken in 1971 at the Whitney exhibition titled Contemporary Black Artists in America. Several artists pulled out of that exhibition protesting the fact that it was curated by white curators. We can see Pusey's work here from 1970. It's hanging right there. And this is a work that we have in the biennial, one of the, I don't want to say it's the oldest one in the biennial, but I would say it's one of the oldest ones in the biennial. From an art historical standpoint, when we look at what Mavis Pusey is doing, we might be reminded of artists like Stuart Davis, right? We might be thinking about artists who are taking abstraction, and particularly geometric abstraction, and turning it into sort of flattening, right? The picture plane in a very traditional way, moving all the way through post-impressionism, right? Then we have cubism, then we have the breakdown of compositional space, et cetera, et cetera. That's a very traditional way of thinking about geometric abstraction. And I don't think necessarily that's what Mavis Pusey's work is all about. While it does matter for her, I think she does reconceptualize a lot of these ideas that are relating to geometric abstraction. And when I say reconceptualizes, what I'm referring to specifically here is how she thinks about the city of New York. City of New York in 1970s, which when you look at this description of a curator from Birmingham Museum of Art in Alabama, talking about this work from 1970, they mentioned that it contains an explosive energy articulated through intersecting angular shapes that reflect the chaos and construction of New York. And it's precisely New York in 1970s that Mavis Pusey was really, really interested in. Now we have to also remember that as an artist of color, as a woman of color, that kind of work was not necessarily fully supported, despite the fact that she was shown in the exhibition in 1971. As I mentioned, Mavis Pusey is not the kind of artist who would be included in art history textbooks on 1960s and 70s abstraction. Construction, the very idea of construction, was extremely important for Mavis Pusey. She started, or her beginnings, an interest in art were to some extent driven by her interest in patterns and textiles, something that she had a little bit more experience of earlier on. But as soon as she moved to New York, that idea of this bustling, loud city really spoke to her. When I say bustling, loud city, I'm also referring to this quote from Mavis Pusey herself. This is her artist statement from her website. Of course, an artist statement written quite a while ago. Quote, I'm inspired by the energy and the beat of the construction and demolition of these buildings. The tempo and movement mold into a synthesis and for me become another aesthetic of abstraction. Now, the question for us, of course, should be, is this idea of a positive sort of energy and construction, is that the only thing that is happening here? Is she just emphasizing the kind of positive parts? And I would say that's not necessarily the case. That is why demolition is also included here. I think it's important to think whenever we acknowledge construction in New York, and I'm going to give you some images here to think about. Here's traffic heading north of 6th Avenue in April 1973. And here is legal dumping of the New Jersey Turnpike in March of 1973. As you can see, World Trade Center is just being constructed. In fact, World Trade Center, I think, will be quite an important point of reference here. When I say construction and demolition, I'm also, of course, referring to this question of displacement and the question of gentrification. This is why I think Mavis Pusey's work continues to be relevant today, continues to be topical today, because it does not focus on a specific construction site or does not focus on a specific building. Rather, it is capturing that sense of energy of the city itself, but also the sense of energy that is a little bit more sinister, I would say. When I say sinister, I don't necessarily mean buildings that are being destroyed left and right, but when we look at this work that's also in the biennial, titled Within Manhattan, excuse me, I was going to put the slide there in just a moment. Within Manhattan from 1977, we see boarded up windows, we see a lot of things happening at once from the construction standpoint, right? It's sort of intentionally chaotic. It might remind us of elevators. It might remind us of boarded up windows, as I said. It might remind us of a construction site itself, or perhaps a skyscraper. And when I say skyscraper, again, I'm bringing it back to World Trade Center specifically. I wanted to address what I think is a really important sensitivity here when talking about World Trade Center. Of course, for those of you folks, particularly New Yorkers, and I'd like to think that I can at this point call myself a New Yorker, having lived here for 12 years. But I wanted to emphasize that the site where these two towers stood is very separate, right? That sacred ground zero is very separate for me and what I'm about to tell you from the actual architecture of these two towers and when they opened to the public. And what I mean here is that not only was it a marvel of architecture in many ways, for some people it was a marvel of architecture, for some less so, not just architecturally, but also in terms of this question of displacement, right? World Trade Center happened and was built because of, or the land on which it was built was taken through eminent domain. And I think this notion and question of gentrification and displacement there is extremely relevant, extremely important. And there was a lot of fear, so to speak, about buildings like the World Trade Center being erected all over the city. Of course, the World Trade Center is an extraordinary example because they were the tallest ones, but there were a lot of office buildings that were being constructed left and right. And of course, that started happening in the 60s with international style and architecture, and then it sort of kept going through different styles. We can talk about World Trade Center as being a take to some extent on international style. Of course, a complication, I would say, of the international style. And we know that Mavis Pusey must have reacted, among other buildings and among other structures, to construction sites like the World Trade Center. And I say this because I wanted to bring it back to 1960s now and to a critic who in the New York Times, I think, foresaw and was able to, ahead of time, tell us that there is a sense of fear, that there's a sense of apprehension about all of these structures going up and a lot of people being displaced, again, places being gentrified, areas being gentrified, and a sense of loss. And at the same time, this loss of physical space, but also loss of sense of equality in the city, right? That it was with gentrification, things are not necessarily getting better for those who already are in this space or in this in this economic rather position where they're not privileged. And when I talk about privilege here, the quote that I was referring to, who's afraid of the big bad buildings? Everyone, because there are so many things about gigantism that we just don't know. I end with Mavis Pusey here, or rather I end my chapter on Mavis Pusey with this quote, because I think it's also very relevant to how we're showing Mavis Pusey's work in the biennial. When you go into the room where her works are hanging, we have three paintings and one work on paper. And you see that there's also Cherise Weston's sculpture that seems to be, I think, in many ways, really asserting space, but also inserting itself into that space and being a literal physical intervention. So I think there's a lot of dynamism that's happening in that room. And in that sense, I wanted to acknowledge what I think the curators were doing here with trying to take that space, right? Here, we're talking about accumulation. We talked about the accumulation of architecture. We talked about the accumulation of space. The palimpsest here is both historical, but at the same time, I think it's quite timeless, because this sense of change, and a sense of change that can cause us to be apprehensive about how the city's transforming, is something that we're still dealing with today, and I think unfortunately we'll continue to deal with today. Maja Ruznic takes on this question of accumulation and palimpsest in a different way. Of course, I should again emphasize that Maja Ruznic is much younger, and that she's coming out of a very different generation, but she's coming out of a generation both politically and culturally that for some people in the United States might not be as familiar, particularly those from the younger generation. I happen to be Eastern European myself, so there's a way in which I relate to Maja Ruznic's work that is perhaps on a slightly more personal level. And I wanted to spend some time explaining what is it that Maja is doing, in my opinion, and how her extraordinary work serves as a record, right? When I talk about these registers, these various ways in which that accumulation happens, each of the artists we're going to look at is going to, and has interpreted this idea of accumulation in their own way. With Maja, what I find to be so compelling is how there's a continued relationship between the power of the colors and the power of the forms, and the sort of very traditional formalist take on how we are as viewers affected by these fundamental, two fundamental sort of building blocks of painting, right? Line and color. But also how there's a very, what I see as a very studious, a very compelling, and a very meticulous record of one's own trauma. And in the case of Maja Ruznic, the trauma is, of course, a very different kind of trauma than we can talk about with Mavis Pusey, of this changing New York, of displacement, et cetera, et cetera. Maja Ruznic, coming originally, or having been born in what was then Yugoslavia, what is today Bosnia and Herzegovina, is an artist who escaped the war in Bosnia. And after escaping the war in Bosnia, I wanted to briefly introduce that concept historically in just a moment. But I will just say that after escaping the war in Bosnia, and after escaping to a number of refugee camps, including a refugee camp in Austria, Maja Ruznic had the kind of experience that I think, again, as I said, a lot of people in the United States of the younger generation, of millennials, would not be familiar with, how one actually responds to war on our, in our sort of age, our generation, right? Unless you're part of the armed forces, it's very difficult for us to think about this question of how one responds to war. I think that very often when we think about these conflicts, when we think about war, we like to bring it to something that's in the past. We like to, not necessarily like, perhaps that's not the best word, but we bring it back to the past. We bring it to World War II. It's important to remember that conflicts, of course, are still happening, and that there's a lot of pain and trauma. As simplistic and as cliched as that might sound, I think there is something very compelling about an artist of the younger generation to attempt to have a perhaps more universalizing, yet at the same time extremely personal take on this question of trauma. Before I get to war in Bosnia and say a little bit more about history, I wanted to emphasize here in this case and acknowledge how this idea of the palimpsest, how this accumulation here with Maja Ruznic also happens on a very formal and physical level, using this technique that we know from Impressionism. In fact, even we can go as far as James W. Turner and Romanticism, scumbling, which is a technique where a thin layer of paint, as you see here on the screen, is loosely applied with a dry brush over an existing one, and that in turn allows some of the lower layer to show through. For Maja Ruznic, importantly, that technique started, as she was explaining to us during the walkthrough, during the curatorial walkthrough, the technique started or was being used by her because she could not afford paint, and she had to save money on paint. And the effect that it has, that actual record, right, of someone who is not coming from a privileged background and standpoint and has to sort of negotiate their own position vis-a-vis what is a very expensive medium. And, you know, these prices keep going up. Again, we rarely think about the actual financial aspect of painting, that it is on such scale, in particular, a very expensive undertaking. And Maja created 6 of those. 2 were selected for the biennial. When I said that she couldn't afford the paint, I also wanted to bring it back now to how she managed to process a lot of that trauma and a lot of her own experiences coming from Bosnia in the 1990s to now create what I see, as I mentioned a moment ago. And I'll return to the iconography here in just a second, but just to acknowledge how she managed to process that trauma and then bring it onto this large scale, almost academic painting. When we talk about the war in Bosnia, it is important to recognize and acknowledge that these levels of suffering, and particularly in terms of suffering of our generation, as I said, it's something that still very much has an impact, continues to have an impact on the Balkans sociopolitically and socioculturally. We know that the situation right now is even worse in many ways because of what's going on in Ukraine. So just as a reminder of what war in Bosnia was and how impactful it was fought between 1992 and 1995 in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was a former Republic of Yugoslavia, and importantly had a multi-ethnic population, right, of Bosniaks or Bosnian Muslims, Serbs, and Croats. And so the ethnic, right, that multi-ethnic conflict is something that still plays an important role. Unfortunately, more than 100,000 people died and more than 2 million were displaced. So now the question is, how do we bring it back to the iconography of Maja Ruznic? And I think here I managed, again, I'm not sure if this is what Maja had in mind when she started painting and when she started this series, but it was quite extraordinary for me to realize that there's a mountain or an entire, well, I guess, yeah, mountains, plural, in Bosnia, where actually the front line was held or was fought during the war in 1990s. And that mountain, interestingly and importantly, is named after Perun, Perun being the god of thunder and sky and the highest god in the Slavic pantheon. Now, why would that in any way relate to Maja Ruznic's work? I think by now you see that in this figurine here from the 12th century, this is a contemporary take, right, on the right-hand side on Perun. But here I'm really drawn to this little figurine and thinking about how Maja Ruznic actually is directly responding to some of these Slavic folk and Slavic paganist or Slavic paganism in her work, something that she's very open about and openly embracing. Now, again, I'm not sure if this is specifically one of those figurines that she looked at, but I wanted to give you another example here of how when we look at the iconography of the work, and as I'm saying this, again, I'm going to bring it back to the place, to the geopolitics of the place, and hopefully continue to remind you folks that even if these references visually are not direct, or references and iconographies that these artists may have not been originally thinking about, the idea here is really to be going sort of macro and micro throughout this entire lecture, throughout the 35 minutes that we have left, and to think about just the diversity of these visual influences and of these iconographical of the iconographical significance, like iconographical programs of these various works. I say this because, again, here I'm going to just very briefly show you Światowit. That would be, in this case, a Polish interpretation of that idol, of that pagan god. But I'm showing this to you because you can now see that these figurines and figures here that we're looking at in Maja Ruznic's work, they may at first have appeared to you as quite perhaps maybe even hopeful, or maybe even fun, and maybe even joyful. But we know that there seems to be, the longer we look at it, we may realize that there seems to be something sinister about them, something that perhaps is bringing it back to specters, or it's making us think about ghosts, specters of something of the past. And so I think that, looking at this not necessarily as like Picasso's cafes in Paris, or Henri Toulouse-Lautrec's cafes in Paris in the late 19th century, but rather to look at it from the standpoint of Maja Ruznic thinking very critically and in a complex way about these iconographies of the land, of the Slavic land that people in the West may not be as familiar with, is a way to bring that trauma and process that trauma, right? While thinking about these other Western visual vocabularies, including, of course, Maja mentioned that she's interested in surrealism, that she's interested in abstract expressionism. Rothko is an important point of reference. And then just to end here, along with that, artists who are associated with symbolism here on the right, we have Alfons Mucha in the really well-known The Slav Epic, probably one of the best-known series of paintings dedicated to Slavic folk and Slavic paganism. And then on the left-hand side, an example of socialist realism from 1948, right? Again, these figures that are, in this case, very healthy and very happy and sort of ready to rebuild the world according to Marxist-Leninist principles. And I should mention, this is a run for Tito, as you can see, or celebrating Tito, the Tito-Stalin split happening in late 1940s, separated Yugoslavia politically from the Soviet Union. So when we think about vocabularies like socialist realism, it's a much more complex issue that I'm not going to get into here, but I wanted to make sure that I show you these images because when we look at Maja's work, when we think about ways in which Maja accumulates these various layers, right? I want us to remember that these various layers refer not only to diverse historical, or not only have diverse historical references, manifest diverse historical references, but there's also a lot to be said about how she remains very rigorous in terms of her art historical references. Now, bringing it on to Karen Olivier, shifting gears, so to speak, allows us and allows me for the first time in this lecture to shift our focus away from painting and into found objects and into sculpture. Here with Karen Olivier, this is the image of installation from the Whitney Biennial. And you can see that Karen Olivier's work, excuse me, sorry, there we go. You can see that Karen Olivier's work here in the middle set against Takako Yamaguchi. I'm not going to talk about Takako Yamaguchi, but I just wanted to acknowledge how the knot, right, the white knot that's hanging and the knots that are visible in Takako Yamaguchi, something to point out as far as curatorial rigor, I would say, is concerned. Now, what is Karen Olivier doing? When we look at this work, right, I'm referring to Karen Olivier's work right here. How many ways can you disappear? That's a work that's to the left, so we're not really seeing it now. I don't know why this that's my bad with the caption, but I wanted to acknowledge here what Karen Olivier is doing from the standpoint of found objects, and specifically, I wanted to think about how she's combining sculpture with these objects that usually, traditionally, perhaps would be referred to as trash, as garbage, right? I'm not going to get into the art historical significance of the ready-made and the found object, because unfortunately, I don't think we have enough time to do that today. But suffice it to say, Karen Olivier has taken an object that had a utilitarian purpose. In this case, those are nets, those are ropes that were being used by fishermen. And then she's placing them in this context that no longer in any way relates to their utilitarian purpose. Now, on top of it, we have these buoys that are held together by a rope. And that rope, interestingly and importantly, is actually cast out of salt. So Karen Olivier immediately is bringing in, I think, two traditionally opposed way of opposite way of art making, right? Because when we think about found objects or the ready-made, there really isn't much labor involved in that, or skill, so to speak. And yet when you combine it with this rope cast out of salt, well, that is as skillful and as meticulous and as challenging for an artist as it gets. And in fact, Olivier, when Olivier spoke about her work, she said she feels herself processing the upheavals and losses of the pandemic period. Quote, they're almost a metaphoric attempt at a solution. and rich with allusions to migration, displacement, and her Caribbean origins. Being born in Trinidad, I think it's really important for us here, or Ken Olivier being born in Trinidad, I think it's really important for us to remember that both that rope made out of salt and also these ropes and these nets that are found objects that are placed on the floor, their meaning goes way beyond just capturing transportation or capturing the ocean. Here you can see a close-up, and you can see that there's something quite extraordinary in how Karen Olivier is actually arranging this into an abstract sculpture, that despite the fact that those are found objects that did not have much of an aesthetic value originally, that Karen Olivier is sort of bringing it together and turning it into an abstract sculpture that is very colorful, and that is brought together, sort of the voice, as I said, are being held together by this rope that is cast out of salt. Now I'm going to get to salt in just a moment, but I wanted to focus, since we're talking about, I mean, I hope the accumulation here, the palimpsest, is clear. It's quite obvious, and it's almost too literal. But I think, as is the case with other artists, Karen Olivier is not stopping at just accumulating objects, right? She is thinking about, to me, my understanding is that Karen Olivier is very rigorous here in terms of how she approaches history. So this is the island from which these, around which these nets and ropes were found. You can see that harbor of that island in Maine in 1908. We see fishermen, right? Or rather, we see boats. We think about it as a place perhaps that is not related to anything historically extraordinarily important. It seems like perhaps the focus is on labor, or the focus is on community, on bringing people together and focusing on this, emphasizing this kind of labor that is that is able to provide for one's community. I think there's much more happening there, and I wanted to bring it now back to that salt part, but also to how these objects that no longer serve a utilitarian purpose are now being used to manifest something that goes way beyond that island that I just showed you, and I think importantly concerns that blue part around here, and the blue part that of course extends across the world, and I'm referring here to oceans and seas and transportation. Now, as with other works, I think there is something more sinister here. Karen Olivier is interested, I should mention before I get to these more sinister parts perhaps, in how monuments function and how monuments function in our contemporary world. And in that sense, she's also very much interested in how these monuments can be reconceptualized. Here, I'm thinking about the salt cast rope as one that refers also to classical sculpture, right? Classical sculpture that I should mention when we think about copies of Greek sculptures, Roman copies of Greek sculptures, we don't think about them as being polychromatic, as being very colorful, but that's exactly what they were originally. We know that the reason as to why they're have been historically appreciated for their whiteness, so to speak, and for the quality of marble is because of the associations that were made with beauty and the ideas of beauty that were brought to the fore during the 18th century, in particular, we're thinking about people like Winckelmann and the Enlightenment period, and how that sort of brought in a very specific idea of what constitutes beauty. But salt, importantly, and here I'm doing a close-up and showing you salt physically, has much more meaning to it that goes beyond just its visual aesthetic qualities of what we're seeing here cast. It's important to remember and to mention that the phrase "not worth his salt" originates from ancient Greece, and it is related to the practice of trading the enslaved for salt. Now, the other thing that I wanted to emphasize here is something that I will admit to you I was not aware of up until fairly recently, which is that salt allowance for early Roman soldiers, called in Latin salarium argentum, evolved into what in the English language today we use as salary, right? So we don't really think about these various, I shouldn't say we, I haven't really been thinking that much about how salt can go way beyond, and the meaning and importance of salt can go way beyond just its value that is, nutritious and necessary for us to survive. And when I say that there's something sinister, of course, I think, folks can slowly but surely be arriving at that conclusion yourselves. But when we think about the enslaved and the practice of the enslaved, and then we think about the empires, of course, what will come to our mind is also the Atlantic slave trade and the histories, I'm specifically saying histories, plural, of enslavement in the Western world, in the United States in particular. But I'm here reminded of artists like James W. Turner, Slavers Throwing Overboard the Dead and Dying, also known as The Slave Ship. It's a work from 1840. And the reason why I think there's a significance here and an important relevance to Karen Olivier's work is not necessarily only because it takes on and addresses the question of suffering and enslavement, but also because when we look at James W. Turner at first, it appears to us primarily, much like Karen Olivier's work, it seems appears to us as something that is just a large collection of various colors and shapes. And it seems there is a sunset or a sunrise going on, but we don't necessarily see the horrors of it at first. And then we realize that that ship and the slavers who were throwing overboard the dead and dying were actually doing that to collect insurance because they could do that in 1840. And of course, we're talking here about Great Britain. Actually, that was earlier than 1840. That's when he painted it. I believe this referred to the trial of the Zong ship, which was much earlier than 1840. But we see that James W. Turner has taken on this very difficult subject here of imperialism and of enslavement. And I think it's the aesthetic sort of quality of James W. Turner's work that brings you in and makes you interested to then realize that there are actual parts of human bodies in shackles. And of course, we know that those are enslaved people who were people of color thrown overboard to collect insurance. Now, Karen Olivier is not as literal in her work, but I think it is important to remember that through salt, through these boys, through the ropes, through these nets, that this is all bringing it back at some point, that accumulation, right? The palimpsest here is bringing it back to histories that might not be as comfortable to a lot of people. And I'm saying a lot of people, I think that one of the responsibilities of institutions like museums is educational responsibility is one where we are self-reflective, and we can even bring it to the land acknowledgement that often can be seen as one that is performative. But I always think that land acknowledgement and our acknowledgement of the past only works if it does make us uncomfortable, at least to some extent, and where we have to confront these histories. This is just to show you as a summary, or rather as a slide to end with this, our discussion about Olivier, a map of intercontinental and transatlantic slave trade, right, in Africa, just seeing the impact of it over time and the numbers that we're seeing here. I think it is really important to remind ourselves how the legacies of this is something that we're still very much facing today, and a lot of course, problems sociopolitically and socioeconomically that are forced upon certain underprivileged groups that still have to negotiate their position vis-a-vis these systems of oppression every day. As we're moving from Karen Olivier to Clarissa Tossin, and I hope my pronunciation for those of you folks who are from Brazil is correct. That is how I heard she pronounced her name. So I'm going with Clarissa Tossin. Is a rather different take on the question of what we would see as accumulation or the palimpsest. Here, my inspiration really for including Clarissa Tossin was because I thought it was extraordinary for her as an artist to take these objects, right, these instruments, these Mayan instruments, and then 3D print them. And I started thinking about, well, 3D printing, that's just accumulation in of itself, right? You're not doing it on top of something that already exists, which palimpsest, I guess, would necessitate. But then I just started thinking about how this work goes way, of course, beyond that 3D printing. That's just part of the process of manufacturing, and that there's so much, again, as is the case with all of the other artists we've looked at, and the two other that, or one other in addition to Tossin that we're going to look at, where this accumulation of the palimpsest here manifests itself, I think, in an architectural space, importantly, through video. So I should say the film for the biennial that Clarissa Tossin created, and the picture that you're seeing here, if you haven't had a chance to see the show on the 5th floor, there's a space that is very immersive that is created for Clarissa Tossin's work. And the film that's being played inside, this is how she described it. Actually, this is information you can find, or a quote that you can find on our website. The film for the biennial undertakes a sensory journey across language, music, and architectural spaces. Some are imagined, some are real, cosmological, and colonized, and they all point back to Maya culture and references to contemporary Maya artistic practices. And I was very drawn to that idea of how one can negotiate these ancient, or one can harness these ancient symbols and ancient instruments and ancient objects to negotiate in the architectural space. Now, I should mention, I'm not a specialist in pre-Columbian Americas, or I should say modern day Central America and modern day South American pre-Columbian cultures. And so even more so, I was drawn to how some of these historical artifacts and historical records, right? Again, literally thinking about the palimpsest here. Temple of Murals here. This is in modern day Mexico, but it's the ancient site, Maya site called Bonampak. And here we see these musicians progressing in a procession, rather, of musicians. And here we have another example of a double whistle. This is from the Metropolitan Museum of Art between 7th and 9th centuries. And so it was quite fascinating to me how Clarissa Tossin is thinking about it, because, of course, she cannot use these instruments. She cannot use these instruments that she would find in, importantly, museums. She would have to 3D print them. Now, once she 3D prints them, what do you do next? And that is what really fascinated me, particularly seeing what Clarissa Tossin said about that process, where she said to negotiate, what she's trying to do is to negotiate the hybridization of cultures and persistence of difference, right? And so when we think about this quote, and we see here Clarissa Tossin holding that 3D printed instrument, and we think how that can be done or sort of manifested in that space of the museum, it is quite challenging, right? Especially when one thinks about architecture. This is something that Clarissa Tossin mentioned in that earlier quote. I wanted to talk about architecture in just a second. Before I do, however, I wanted to clarify that this entire video and entire installation was done also because Clarissa Tossin very rigorously, historically and scholarly, one could even say, collaborated with a composer and with a musician. Now, this has not been publicly announced yet, but I was told by our public programs team that I can announce it. So I think it's a good moment to mention that on May 30th, there will be a whole program taking place at the Whitney Museum of American Art, 99 Gansevoort Street, where you folks will have a chance to, if you attend, you'll have a chance to see Clarissa Tossin talk to her collaborators and discuss her process on how that all came into being, right? Came into being because they had to figure out a way to play these instruments, and they had to figure out the way of what to play with those instruments. I also mentioned the architectural part, right? So that record, that historical record, is not just through sound, not just through music, but also through actual architectural spaces that are being explored by Clarissa Tossin. And here, this is part of a video. This is one from 2017. Now, of course, when I refer to our installation includes some of that imagery, but it was done specifically, performed specifically for, and installed specifically for the biennial. But you can see that human hand there, right? So this actual direct intervention in that architectural space. And then when I thought about what that architectural space means for Clarissa Tossin, and when she started talking about how that was being appropriated in early 20th century, well, I of course wasn't surprised that it was being appropriated, but I guess it didn't occur to me how manifest, how obvious it is in some of that modern architecture, including architecture by Frank Lloyd Wright. Now, it's not a surprise, of course, to us that Western architects have been drawing upon, and artists have been drawing upon, and appropriating imagery and symbols and sacred, often spiritual objects that were from other broadly construed, not quote unquote non-Western cultures. That is something that is very much part and parcel of Western tradition, just to take what does not belong to one, but seems appealing. So that's sufficient of a reason to take it. And it seems here, Frank Lloyd Wright, with all of my passion for him as an architect and appreciation, you know, Clarissa Tossin's point is, of course, very valid when one compares, particularly visually, how her focus in her videos on these spaces, right? Spaces now occupied, or populated rather, I should say, by performers. That is responding, that space is responding directly to this idea of reclamation, or is reclaiming, while also acknowledging that that process itself is an extremely challenging process, right? Because of how much colonialism and imperialism have destroyed a lot of these structures, not physically. I'm also talking about historical structures, structures of collecting, the question of provenance. Sometimes it's just impossible, or it will take a very long time, right, to figure out even where some of these objects were coming from because they were stolen. So Clarissa Tossin is really thinking here along various experiential registers, I should say, and being very engaged with how that can be used to then aesthetically, because I think aesthetics is extremely important for Clarissa Tossin, and thinking about this, negotiating this concept of beauty, right? Another aspect of this that I think is crucial. Our curators, Chrissy Isles and Meg Ullman, mentioned that the question of beauty and how that manifests itself in contemporary art is very important to them in this show. So I think something that I'd like for us to keep in the back of our minds. Now, we're at 3:45 and I will be done in the next 5 minutes. So I just wanted to give you folks an update, and we're going to have 10 minutes for questions. I'm ending with Suzanne Jackson. I mentioned that Suzanne Jackson is an artist whose work perhaps best fits that idea of the palimpsest. The reason behind it is because her process of literally accumulating paint on that surface and then turning it into these hanging paintings, these hanging sculptures paintings without support, right, is something that is very much evident and very obvious. In fact, when we look at her work, titled Palimpsest for it, we see that it's literally even using that in the title. Now, if you had a chance to see Suzanne Jackson's work at the Biennial, you may have experienced something that I think is quite extraordinary from an aesthetic and, again, experiential standpoint for a viewer, which is to see paintings that do not have support and yet manage and are capable of affecting you in a very similar way as paintings that have support because of the medium that Suzanne Jackson here is using, a medium that she's really interested in, which is acrylic, right? She's not using oil. In fact, the story, I believe, that she tells is that her car was broken into and a lot of her oil paints were stolen once, and she switched to acrylic and sort of never looked back. Now, I believe I did not butcher this story and oversimplify it. If I did that, then I apologize, and I'll be happy to be corrected if that was an oversimplification, but that is the story that I knew from Suzanne Jackson. And as we're thinking about aesthetics, I wanted to show you here a close-up, which I think appears very traditional, appears very much abstract expressionist-like, appears like something that if you had it as an autonomous object hanging on a gallery wall, that would sort of fit all of the criteria and expectations of what abstract painting in the Western tradition is supposed to be about. But that is not what Suzanne Jackson is interested in. We see here a process that is very meticulous, but I think a process of accumulation that actually is a process of historical and art historical response to the past and to these traditions of painting. So here's the quote that I wanted to read out loud to you. I only have one more after this one. Jackson initially deployed painting almost like watercolor, setting down layer upon layer of washy pigment to build up dreamy images of Black figures commingling with birds, flowers, and hearts. Jackson often begins a piece on a plastic-covered table, then peels the acrylic off and hangs it to dry using acrylic support, so gel medium support. And I was immediately reminded of Helen Frankenthaler as I saw this work, because Helen Frankenthaler's idea of pouring, right, accumulation there happens through pouring, is very subtle. There's something very, as critics and art historians have noticed, almost stereotypically feminine, right? I think what it does is it responds to Pollock in a very important way, but of course we know that Helen Frankenthaler was often criticized for being almost overtly decorative. Not necessarily criticism I personally agree with, but that's beside the point. What does matter for us is how Helen Frankenthaler used color, right, and that idea of accumulation here in a way that I think still remained within this aesthetic, almost romanticizing context of painting that we can bring all the way back to the beginning of the Western tradition. That is not necessarily what Suzanne Jackson is doing. She mentioned here, this is a quote, "Going to school for theater design made her a better draftswoman." And here a direct quote from Suzanne Jackson, quote, "That's another element I've been really fascinated by," she says, "how to achieve this beautiful line," right? So again, she's thinking about beauty. She's not ignoring questions of beauty, and she's not ignoring ideas of beauty, but she is reconceptualizing them, redefining them. We can think about what Linda Benglis was doing as something very similar, right? Again, this accumulation, this literal palimpsest of forms here. This is a fairly recent installation at the Whitney in the Balance Painting and Sculpture between October 19th, 2022 and March 5th, 2023, if you had a chance to see that work. But Suzanne Jackson is doing something different there. It's not just the accumulation of paint. There are elements there you may have seen in that close-up that I showed you a moment ago of the palimpsest that brings also the detritus of her studio and elements that are completely unrelated to the composition, to the aesthetic quality of that composition itself. And I'm reminded here, and this is what I'm going to end with, of artists like Kurt Schwitters, but we can also think of other artists who are doing collage in the aftermath of World War I. And what matters here is how what you take from outside, or rather from around you, these non-traditional artistic materials, when you grab them and bring them and put them onto the canvas, onto the painting surface, right? That they are signifiers of that space, of that moment. And I think for Suzanne Jackson to combine that kind of visual vocabulary of it real, right? Accumulating the real, but also accumulating the real paint and giving you something that negotiates, giving you a product, giving you a painting without support that negotiates its own position vis-a-vis the viewer, vis-a-vis the art historical tradition, and vis-a-vis the concept of accumulation and the palimpsest that I have had a tremendous joy and privilege talking to you folks about. So I'll end here, 3:51. I was almost there, but I'm happy to open it up to questions right now.